We have got to change the mindset of Canadians that immigrants need us and we don't need them. That somehow we allow immigrants to come in and we're doing them a favor. It's the other way around.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce McDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our knowledge partner, Carter's Professional Corporation, and our supporting partner, Sage Canada. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. This week on the podcast, I'm grateful to chat with Debbie Douglas, Executive Director of OCASI, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, about the nonprofit workforce through the lens of the immigrant experience. Given the late 2022 release of Diversity is Our Strength, a report that looked at employment data in our sector and its findings related to the important role that charities nonprofits play in the employment journey for newcomers, we felt it was important to explore this information with a real expert. OCASI is a charitable organization that acts as a collective voice for immigrant-serving agencies and coordinates responses to shared needs and concerns. Its membership comprises more than 200 community-based organizations in the province of Ontario. OCASI's mission is to champion equity and human rights for immigrants and refugees through advocacy, collective action, collaborative planning, research, capacity building, and information and knowledge transfer. In this episode, we're going to dig into issues around credentials for immigrants, making courageous choices as employers and providing decent work for newcomers to Canada, and thinking about the future of how important immigration is to our country. Debbie, thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Absolutely. Looking forward to our conversation, Bruce.
Let's start with some questions about the overall landscape. First, for listeners not familiar with OCASI, can you tell us more about your work and how you help your members support newcomers to Ontario?
Absolutely. OCASI is the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. We're the provincial body for about 240 agencies that provide services to immigrants and refugees across the province, helping with their settlement and adaptation to a new land. OCASI has a dual mandate. Primarily, our work is around policy advocacy, ensuring that there are fair immigration policies in place, that our processes are fair and equitable as much as possible. And in addition, we do capacity building work with our member agencies. We have a very robust training program from everything to the foundations of settlement, which is basically immigrant and refugee services and how you provide those services to immigrants and refugees, as well as folks who are undocumented and non-status, to violence against women and everything in between. More recently, we've been paying attention to training on the issues of Indigenous reconciliation, anti-Black racism, etc.
That's great. Can you also maybe tell us a little bit about, roughly how many newcomers are coming to the province each year, and who are the folks who are coming to Canada?
Not surprisingly, the vast majority of newcomers to Canada come to Ontario. You must have heard that MTV, but most newcomers go to the three major centers, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. But Ontario gets the vast majority. So, for example, in the 2021-22 years, just shy of 230,000 permanent residents came to Ontario, which is about 50% or so of all total arrivals in Canada, which is just over 400,000. They come from everywhere in the world, but reflect the numbers that come into Canada, with about over 60% coming from Asia. We're looking at India, China, and the Philippines, not necessarily in that order. I think the Philippines is probably higher than China. And in the last little while, we saw a significant number of Syrians come in as government-assisted and privately sponsored refugees because of the wars. In 2015, Canada put in place a very robust resettlement program for Syrians. And so those numbers were reflecting at around 4% of arrivals here in Canada, and that was reflected here in Ontario as well.
Well, certainly with those numbers, that really speaks to the scale of your work and the importance of having a strong system to welcome those people to Canada.
Absolutely.
We're going to talk a little bit about the charitable and nonprofit sector now. National data from Statistics Canada, recently analyzed by Imagine Canada to identify employment trends in the nonprofit sector, uncovered that nationally, employees in our sector are more than twice as likely to be immigrants. In addition, half of all jobs held by immigrant women are in our sector. So charities and nonprofit organizations, which employ 2.4 million people, are by far the country's biggest employers of immigrant women. Were you surprised by these numbers? And if you weren't, why not?
I wasn't surprised. We've heard this and we know this anecdotally. It was good to see the numbers crunched. We weren't surprised because we know that immigrants have a very difficult time accessing work commensurate with their education and experience. We also know that the nonprofit sector, and certainly the immigrant and refugee serving sector as a subsector of the nonprofit sector, is often place of first contact for immigrants. And many of our agencies, not only here in Ontario, but that's true across the country, often hire based on language. So people have particular skills, but then the language skill is also important because it's so important to provide services in first language for immigrants and refugees. So no surprise that immigrant women are overrepresented in the nonprofit sector, and the nonprofit sector, of course, is predominantly female, immigrant or not. But then on top of the fact that there's so many immigrant women working in the nonprofit sector is that the vast majority are racialized. And so then that itself also brings up other issues in terms of the fact that we're bringing in so many immigrants from the global south. We're bringing in people who are highly qualified and highly educated, and yet the majority of women are finding work in a sector, which is good. It's often a place of first contact, first jobs. Immigrants come in and need to work to pay rent and feed their families. And the nonprofit sector tends to be a bit more flexible in terms of recognizing people's lived experiences as being valuable, paying attention to a mix of experience and education. And as I said, language is often a grounding in terms of what is expected, certainly in the immigrant and refugee serving sector. So yes, we know that we have a large majority of folks here in the sector. It's a good thing and it's a bad thing, right? It's a good thing that we have women who are finding work and are able to put their skills to benefit other immigrants. Yet at the same time, it is sad and we run the risk of beginning to de-skill people because they're not able to work in the field for which they are qualified. Often that is the case. One of our colleagues a few years ago, Dr. Turigan Adnan, who was the director of Ceres, which was a research think tank here in Ontario, did a research and found about the sheer number of internationally trained professionals who were working in the nonprofit sector as frontline practitioner. And that was specifically because they could not find work that was commensurate with their education and skills in the field for which they were qualified. And so the nonprofit sector became a plan B, in a matter of speaking, for them.
We're going to explore a little bit about this sort of double-edged sword here as we go forward. The data also shows that workers in the sector are underpaid compared to employees economy-wide. And that's especially true for those working in community nonprofits. We had a pretty good idea that this was the case, but now we have data to illustrate this reality. And the picture is kind of worse than what we had imagined. The average salary for those working for community nonprofits is $38,716, while employees economy-wide receive an average salary of $57,137,000. So the nonprofit sector provides a pathway to employment for hundreds of thousands of newcomers seeking employment, but at the same time, these individuals are pushed to lower-paying jobs. So from your perspective and from your members, how is the nonprofit sector perceived by the immigrant-serving agencies you work with as a place of employment?
That's a very good question. The immigrant and refugee serving sector, we see ourselves as a poor cousins of the nonprofit. So here we are talking about how low wages are in the broad nonprofit. Imagine within our sector, and especially within various parts of our subsector. So we realize that ethno-specific organizations and women's organizations are even paying lower. We do an annual salary survey as a way to give agencies something to negotiate with in terms of funders, and are often shocked at how low some of our wages are, especially outside of the larger urban centers, where there's just no way that people working in our sector are paid a living wage. And so that's a significant issue, especially when we talk about the fact that the sector is saturated with racialized women. So it's no surprise then that racialized women and racialized immigrant women in particular are overrepresented in poverty numbers, right? Are overrepresented in low wage numbers. And then these things then have a cascading impact in terms of people's immigration journey.
We're going to spend a little bit more time in that paradox because I think this is a critically important series of findings from this report. So there's no doubt that the contribution of immigrants to the sector are something to celebrate. However, many immigrant women work in the nonprofit sector not because it's their first choice, but because their options are limited. And you mentioned it. It feels like a good news, bad news scenario. The sector is an important employer, but perhaps for the wrong reasons. So as you think about this paradox, what does it say about the employment barriers being faced by immigrants, especially immigrant women?
That it is the number one issue for us. And two things. So let me speak about it first from the policy perspective. Immigrant women, we continue to say as Canadians that we want to recruit and attract the world's brightest. And yet we bring in these people based on their qualifications. The majority of folks coming in as permanent residents are coming through our skilled workers class. And they come with families, and the spouses of the primary applicant are just as educated as the primary applicant. So if women are coming in with postgraduate degrees as well as their spouses, same-sex relationships, similarly, immigrants are coming in highly educated. And yet folks are not able, although they're being brought in based on that education and based on the kind of skills and knowledge that they have, they arrive in Canada and then they find that they face all of these barriers to participating in the labor market. And I'm not only talking about those who work in regulated professions, who have to jump through hoops to get their credentials recognized. Often we hear from Canadian employers that they're not really sure how to read the credentials. So we have a number of services here in Ontario. We have World Education Services, which is one of our member agencies who do a tremendous work in the field of credential assessments and working with Canadian employers to begin to make the argument that, this degree equals this and be able to work with those sectors. But even in the unregulated fields, people are not able to find employment commensurate with their experience. And this is particularly true, as we know, medium and small businesses are the big employers in Canada. And they're the ones who say that they have the most problem hiring people. When we hear things about that resumes are not responded to based on people's last name, that is a problem. And it's having an impact on immigrants who are coming in with their qualifications. That if my name is not John Smith, then I'm not getting a call back. We must also address issues of how issues of race and religion and language, and we know class also plays a role depending on immigrants making low wages. They tend to live in poor areas in the city. So then postal code becomes an issue as well. So these are all barriers that have a negative impact in how immigrants are able to move forward with their settlement and integration journey. When folks cannot find work that is commensurate with their education and experience, we take skills that's needed in other countries, we bring them here, and we deskill those people. We waste the talent that we've brought in, and that is tragic. We often hear of many immigrants making the decision to return to their countries of origin, but we also know that places like China are putting incentives in place to have the nationals come back home, as opposed to staying here in Canada and other places in the global north, not being able to participate in the way that they are able to participate.
Well, we're going to stay with this theme of some of the barriers, but maybe flip it a little bit to some solutions. So in thinking about the challenges facing newcomers in finding decent work, how can we as a nation work to change the mindset, not just of Canadian charities and nonprofits, but also Canadian companies to provide more flexible and inviting hiring practices that would allow for more immigrants to be viewed positively? How do we create and turn these barriers into solutions and opportunity?
As I was saying, I think our large institutions, so if we think about our financial institutions or tech and IT institutions, I think they got it, right? They're hiring internationally. They work within a global context. There is much movement in between people, as you can see from the tens of thousands of people that come in through our temporary workers class. It is folks who are coming to stay permanently in Canada who need to be hired by medium and small organizations and companies that are facing those barriers. There are a number of things that we need to look at. In terms of the regulated professions, we need to break down provincial barriers. So if folks are being brought in by the federal government based on their education and skills, then they should be able to work in any place in Canada. So if I go through an accreditation process in Ontario and there's a job in BC, I should be able to go to BC knowing that my credentials have been assessed and recognized here in Ontario. So that's the first thing. We need to break down some of those interprovincial issues around regulated professions. We also need to do education with employers. Some of our member agencies, we have the Toronto Region Immigration Employment Council, for example, as well as some of our other employment agencies who are focused on employer engagement. They spend time with employers trying to break down some of the stereotypes and prejudices and racism, for that matter, that companies may have. They talk to employers about the value add of bringing in immigrants, right? You talk to companies in the capitalist system about the bottom line, which is a profit. The more diverse your population, the broader your markets, the more your profit. It's unfortunate that that's the way we have to go, as opposed to, people should be really taken at face value. But if you can make the argument around more profit, we begin to see those spaces opening up. And as the Canadian government, I think more and more as we talk about the fact that we need immigrants more than immigrants need us, that Canada is facing a very competitive world that's competing for what Canadian government likes to say, as I said before, the world's brightest, then we need to ensure that companies understand that companies are able to see the value add that immigrants are bringing, and that they're able to hire folks without so much angst attached to it, right? That companies cannot be saying that they have hundreds of jobs that are empty and yet turn around and not hire the people who are here to fill those jobs. I think one of again, and some of my colleagues and I have been calling it a sin that we went through a pandemic. We're in a health crisis where there are so many families without family doctors, for example, and we have hundreds of family doctors here in Ontario who are internationally trained, who are not able to work in their field as medical practitioners. For what purpose, right? When there is such a gap, we're in the middle of a pandemic. And yet we had all of these doctors and nurses and other medical experts whose skills are being wasted. And we haven't figured out a way to socialize them into our system. And so it's not only the big corporations, but it's also some of our public institutions as well, that we need to figure out a way to have these people hired, because we can't have all of these skilled people that we're bringing in, all of these educated people that we're bringing in at the same time our corporations are saying that they're wanting for workers, and we're not putting these two things together. So I think government has a role to play. As I said, our sector is already doing what it can in terms of educating employers about the role that immigrants can play in the labor market, and employers themselves need to step up. Our boards of trades need to step up.
So many nonprofits rely on funding to fulfill their mission. However, our sector is severely underfunded, which hinders the ability of organizations to meet the ever-increasing demand for their services, and leaving immigrant and racialized women in lower-paid, precarious jobs despite their education and qualifications. It's clear that we want to improve the material conditions of immigrant women, and interventions that improve working conditions in the nonprofit sector are crucial. In addition to OCASI, a number of organizations have been advocating for decent work and improved conditions for our workers, notably the Ontario Nonprofit Network. In the report Imagine Canada released in the fall of 2022, we included a series of recommendations for nonprofit leaders, for example, offer competitive wages, eliminate racial and gender pay gaps. What would you say to nonprofit organizations that feel that implementing decent work practices are unattainable? What small steps can they take to help advance decent work?
The message we've been sending out as the provincial council to our member agencies is that it is not unattainable, that we have a responsibility to ensure that all employees working within our sector are paid a living wage. That as a sector that is so heavily female and especially so heavily immigrant and racialized, that we especially have a responsibility to ensure people are fairly compensated. One of the things that we are doing this year is to reach agreement across the membership that all funders will be asked for nothing less than a 5% as a floor in terms of increases to budgets. It took a while, and we're there. We hear from many organizations, including women's organizations, that because there are a variety of funders, if one funder gives 5% and the one gives 3%, how do we get these things? And we've been pushing. You know what? If funders are not willing to step up in terms of compensation and you must find the money within existing budgets, then it means that you reduce programming. And I think those are the positions that we need to take as nonprofit sector, and we need to take it together. We cannot afford to continue to race each other to the bottom. We cannot put in proposals where we overpromise for very little money so that the funder funds me and not my organizational partner down the street. It doesn't help our employees. It doesn't help our organization. It doesn't help our communities. I think that as a nonprofit sector, we have to see ourselves as employers that we are. And as employers who are committed to social justice, we work within our sector, in the nonprofit sector. We're the care sector. We're about creating communities that are healthy in every way, economically, socially. Then that means then we must walk our talk. And to walk our talk, it means then that we do fair compensation, that we join with our other sectors in the nonprofit and call for better funding for our sector. As you know, the biggest issue facing our sector right now is our recruitment and retention. Young people are no longer willing to work 60 hours and get paid for 35. And so decent work has to be our catchword. And if we say we are about justice, then we have to also be about economic justice. We have to see how it is that we as a sector cannot be contributing to having racialized women, racialized immigrant women living in poverty.
These are great points. Thank you. With our last question, we're going to take it up a notch to a more sort of macro or sort of a broader thought perspective here. Canada's a nation that's going to welcome 1.5 million newcomers in the next 3 years. Governments, funders, nonprofit leaders all have a role to play in improving the conditions for immigrants, for newcomers. As we think about our sector and its role, as we think about broad governmental sector, as we think about the corporate community, what can we collectively do to help advance and influence society to ensure a better future for newcomers to Canada and immigrant workers?
We have got to continue to speak about the value add that immigrants bring to Canada. We have got to change the mindset of Canadians that immigrants need us and we don't need them. That somehow we allow immigrants to come in and we're doing them a favor. It's the other way around. It is the other way around. Canada needs immigrants. We have an aging population. We have a low birth rate. Our only way forward is through bringing in new people, and that is through immigration. And if we're not creating a space where immigrants feel that they can come, people are no longer coming and saying, oh, I'm here because so my children can do better. People are not leaving jobs where they're well compensated, where there's value, and coming to a place where they must begin from the beginning and then not have any of their skills be valued. As I said, there is significant competition in the world for immigrants. And as Canadians, if we are going to continue to attract and have immigrants come and stay and contribute, then we have to look at how it is that what it is that we are providing in terms of immigrant settlement and adaptation. We have to look at how it is that we are ensuring that immigrants are able to contribute to the best of their ability and that it is recognized, it is compensated, and it is valued.
Great comments. It's so interesting if you think about your ending thoughts around the future of our nation being inextricably linked to immigration, our workforce.
Our workforce, our demographics. When I think of smaller provinces and issues of out-migration versus in-migration, how do we ensure that people, new immigrants, are going to PEI and staying? How do we ensure they're going to Newfoundland and staying? How do we ensure here in Ontario that everyone is not staying within the Greater Toronto area, but we can have people in Kenora in the north who are willing to work in our mining industries, and that we are building infrastructure so that they stay? We are ensuring that there is enough community so that they're wanting to stay, that we are creating welcoming communities. So people are wanting to come and to stay in some of the smaller areas where they don't see themselves reflected. So how do we ensure that we begin to make those differences? I tell the story all the time that I was invited out to New Brunswick to speak on a panel, and there are a whole bunch of mayors there, right? In fishing villages with like 800 people, and everybody wanted immigrants. And my question to them, well, what are you doing to create a welcoming community? Right? So that when a family comes from northern Nigeria, they feel welcome because they're coming to work in your schools as teachers. They're coming to probably set up a medical practice. How do you ensure that after a year, they don't say, I'm heading to Toronto?
This opportunity, it really speaks, though, to the importance of our sector in this as well. Being such an important employer, your comments about how are we as sector organizations going to ensure that we are fighting for the appropriate levels of funding so that as newcomers to Canada spread out to the kinds of communities that you've just referenced, and some of them will go and work for charities and nonprofits, that's decent work, that they can feed their families, have gainful employment, be able to live in good places and have prosperous lives. It reinforces how our sector needs to work together to ensure that it is not just viewed as a place where people come and receive services, but is an important employer, is an important place in the immigrant journey and experience, and that we should work harder to ensure that it is a real value to those who are coming to Canada.
Ashe, ashe, ashe. Could not have said it better.
Well, thank you so much, Debbie, for taking the time today. I think this is going to be really important and valuable for those who decide to tune in and listen.
I hope so. Great chatting with you, Bruce.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsors, Carter's Professional Corporation and Sage Canada, for supporting our podcast.